Welcome everyone, we're excited to share some country wisdom with you.
King Solomon had a thing or two to say about the path to wisdom. In Proverbs 4, he wrote, "Let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. Keep straight the path of your feet, and all your ways will be sure."
Join us now for Country Wisdom.
God rested after creation. That comes before the Hebrews. It comes even before the creation of the modern world and civilization as we know it. And so we honor the Sabbath. We're very serious about it. We get to spend more time with our family. We do no news. We do no work. And it says very clearly in the scriptures, "For 6 days you shall work, and the seventh day you shall rest." If you are feeling overrun by society, you might be feeling depressed or anxious, here's just one way that you might be able to improve. Turn your phone off for 1 day. No contact, no social media, no work. Your mental health will improve dramatically.
Jim, we have been going through the history of the Sabbath, where it began, how there's a through line through Scripture with Jesus and the apostles, the early church, and beyond. Okay, we obviously live in a modern society, and we were talking earlier about, okay, where does the Sabbath fit into modern life? And in my view, it's even more important. I think it has so much to offer modern humans. I don't know if you've looked around, but as far as I'm concerned, it's falling apart.
How do you miss it?
Families, society, human beings are just falling apart. And so I think the Sabbath has answers to a lot of our problems.
It does, and you're going to really enjoy our guest today. It took me a while to find him and get him. He answered the call. Dr. Bynum, tell us who you are to our audience and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a psychiatrist, and my expertise and interest is really in holistic mental health. When I was going through residency, my psychiatric training program, I saw very quickly that people were primarily focusing on medications to get well. Now, I will say I'm not anti-medication. In fact, I use medications in my practice, but I've also realized very quickly during my training that when you use just medications, guess what happens? Well, unfortunately, people might feel a little better temporarily, but they don't get better and stay better. And so what we find is that medications, while they can help alleviate some of the symptoms of mental health problems, they don't address the root causes. And so that's really where I got excited, because I started delving into the research, and I saw that when we understand what actually causes mental health problems, and we start to address those issues, that people not only get better, but they stay better.
Now, you've been in practice for how many years, roughly?
About 15 years.
About 15 years. And have you seen a difference between when you started and the psyche of the population versus now?
Basically, he wants to know, am I right? And people are getting crazy.
Thank you, Janice.
Well, I think that's a great question. And what's interesting is I've seen both personally, as far as the patients that I treat, but also in the research that trend is accurate. In other words, we're seeing there is an increase in the rise of the prevalence of mental health problems, and especially when it comes to things like anxiety and depression and PTSD and ADHD for that matter. So the list kind of goes on and on. But also, I've noticed that oftentimes the severity is also increased as well. So both the prevalence and then the severity of the illnesses.
It amazes me of what we're seeing everywhere in the world. It seems like the whole world, as Janice was actually saying, falling apart. Now, how do you counsel people? What do you do with all of this? It seems like the bathtub of problems is so huge, even if you dive in, you're not going to help anybody.
Well,
and how would the Sabbath specifically, taking that time with God and family and stepping away from daily routine, how that would also help in the fight for your mental health?
Yeah, those are great questions. And again, I think it comes back to really helping people to take a look to understand what is at the root of their mental health symptoms. And so, each person that comes in, we go through a detailed history, we understand their background, their predisposition genetically and all of that. But then we also look at their environment, we look at their stressors. And one thing that I've noticed is that people's stress levels have ratcheted up significantly over the last few years. And, in the past, we've always had things like relational issues, job issues, financial worries. But now, those things in and of themselves are often increased. In other words, people seem to be having more financial problems, more relational problems. But also there's added things that we weren't really seeing before. For example, we're seeing in the last several decades a significant rise in a sense of isolation. We're also seeing a significant rise of not only those stressors that we talked about, but also external stressors. Stressors where people are seriously wondering, is this the end of the world? How much longer are things gonna go before we see some world war break out again, or some other stressor that totally yanks the rug under the financial system, or whatever it might be, right? And so people, their stress levels are going through the roof.
But haven't we had a lot of those stressors in the past? I mean, people went through World War I, World War II, and
Or
Korean
even before
War.
that, the big stressor might be, do we have enough food for the winter?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I might like food, and so I'm sure that would be a stressor for me.
Not going to say a word.
But you better not. But it still seems like we just have it coming from every direction. Every day there's some new problem.
And that's the whole issue that I'm seeing is, yes, there were stressors in the past. And of course, those world wars that you mentioned, and war in general, is very stressful. But now we're having stressors on top of that. I mean, in my mind, when I look around, there's probably just as much war and bloodshed. Maybe it's not world war right now, but there's multiple conflicts going on. And, I don't know all the data on that. But what I'm saying is people are being hit in multiple angles. And when that stress level increases, and when you don't have that buffer of a solid community and connection, then that makes it very difficult to handle stress. And so what we start seeing is a lot of the rise in disorders, I believe, are a combination of a rise in stress and a rise in disconnection. And the beautiful thing about the Sabbath, when we look at the Sabbath message and what that can do for our mental and our physical health, for that matter.
Because I'm ticking off things just in my non-medical mind, where I'm going, well, Sabbath would help with that.
Yes, exactly. And so that's what we see, because, acute stress is normal, and what acute stress is it's short-term stress. And that's normal and even can be healthy. Like, it can motivate us to get out of bed, and if I know I have an exam or a paper due or something to prepare for, then my stress level goes up. That is a good thing. It helps me to prepare and be motivated to do so. That's not the problem for our health, mentally or physically. What's actually the problem for our health is the chronic, ongoing stress. And so what we see with the Sabbath is that it essentially helps to break up that chronic stress. Because chronic stress, again, is stress that actually starts wearing down the immune system. It's stress that will start to cause long-term physical illnesses, like mental health illnesses, and also physical illnesses. And so the definition of a chronic stress is stress that goes on for weeks. And so what the Sabbath does is it basically acts like a reset button for that stress.
Every week.
That's right.
The pressure cooker release valve.
That's exactly it. And I didn't always keep the Sabbath myself in my life. And, a lot of times we make excuses like, oh man, I just don't think I have enough time to keep the Sabbath, right? Well, I would argue against that and say we don't have enough time not to keep the Sabbath. And the reason I say that is because when we keep the Sabbath and we actually are doing things that restore our mind, our body, and our spirit, and our relationships, that now it's like hitting that reset button, releasing I like that pressure cooker analogy, and now I'm ready to face another week. And in that new week, after I've hit that reset button, I can think more clearly, I'm gonna be a lot more efficient, get a lot more done. I've noticed in my life, I get way more done now that I keep the Sabbath than I ever did before.
If you are already thinking, I'm never going to remember all of this, we have a study guide that you're going to want to get. This is the lost day of history. This is study guide number 7. You can find it at talkingdonkeyinternational.org. Ask for study guide number 7.
You know the impact of Christ's message. It heals, it transforms. Do you have the eye for a great post, the heart for a kind comment, the skill to build community?
Talking Donkey International is looking for passionate volunteers, from seasoned content creators to newcomers.
We are a Christian community dedicated to sharing Christ's love.
This is a real opportunity to turn your time into ministry. Scan the QR code.
To make a lasting impact.
Why does the Sabbath, though, you'd mentioned to me, it's got a specific significance for people. And you've seen that proved out in history and even now.
Oh, yeah. No, it's fascinating. I mean, when you look at the historical and the biological aspect of the Sabbath, there's so much to be said there. And I'm even thinking here, like, where should I even start with all that? Because, I mean, we could look at the studies in animals, we could look at the studies in humans, we could look at the historical data, we could look at the Adventist health studies, and we could look at the blue zones. I mean, those are 5 areas that we could look at right there, just off the top of my head, that help to underlie the importance of the Sabbath.
My question fits into one of those, probably more than one, because when we were chatting before, when you first got here, and I was an English major, so a new word to me pops up, and I'm going, what is that? And it was a something rhythm. It sounded like circus rhythm. And I went, wait, I know all about the circadian rhythm. I've learned that. What is this other thing you were mentioning? And it was fascinating, because I had not even heard that.
Yes, so that's one of the most exciting things that I've learned over the last few years about how we have, as human beings and as other biological organisms as well, that there are different biological rhythms. Of course, we can all think and talk about like the annual rhythm.
We know that's based on planets and the sun.
Exactly, the Earth going around the sun, and then of course even the monthly rhythm where we have the moon cycle, right? And
daily,
then we have the daily,
which
the Earth is spinning on its axis, and we get a day. And so from the daily rhythm, we have the Circaseptan, or I'm sorry, the circadian rhythms, and that's very clearly focused, or we should say maybe connected to the daylight and the night. But then what has been even more fascinating over the last several decades is science has uncovered something called the Circaseptan rhythms. And the Circaseptan rhythms are rhythms that take place over the course of 1 week. And what they started finding out...
Because some people, you might ask, where did a week even come from?
Exactly,
if it wasn't established at creation.
That's exactly it.
Where we were given 7 days.
That's exactly it. And so it's fascinating, because what we see is that there are biological rhythms even in unicellular organisms, some bacteria, for example, and even some algae, that they have weekly rhythms, biorhythms, where they function differently on a weekly basis. And then they've also looked at different animals. And for example, rats, they have melatonin.
Which I normally don't like thinking about.
But this is a fascinating, I think you'll like this one. So for the rats, they found that they have a weekly rhythm, and it's on Saturday that their melatonin level rises the most. And of course, we think about melatonin. What does melatonin help with?
It's supposed to help you calm down and be able to sleep.
It's supposed to help with rest, right? What is the Sabbath? It's about
rest.
When is the Sabbath? It's on Saturday. It's the 7th day, right? So even with the rats, we see this weekly rhythm, and that rhythm actually is strongest on Saturday, that with the melatonin secretion. And then of course,
where literally it seems like God designed them to mellow out.
That's right.
When on Saturday, that is just it's mind-blowing, because I'd never heard anything like that. It's like, are you kidding me?
He built it into his creation.
Right.
That's right. That's right. And there's also, anecdotal stories about bees having a 7-day rhythm and resting more on Sabbath, Saturday, and also even beavers as well.
The beavers I had heard about not long ago.
The 7th-day beaver, right? It's fascinating. And one time I was given this talk about the Sabbath and the Circaseptan rhythms and all that. And a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, I got to tell you a story. And I said, oh, I love stories. And so she said, there was a time before I knew anything about the Sabbath, and I definitely didn't keep a day of rest. I didn't really believe in God much, but I took a couple months in the woods. And I was going through some personal difficulties in my own life. And I was writing in a journal every day. And every day I would write a little bit about what I was doing. And every once in a while, I noticed that the forest was really quiet. And so I made a note in my journal, and she said it wasn't until, I think maybe even several years later, and she started to learn about the Sabbath and that sort of thing, that she asked herself, I wonder if those days that it was quieter in the forest, if that was a Sabbath day. So she went back in her journal. She said, sure enough, every time that she made a notation in her journal that the forest is especially quiet today, I don't know why, it was actually on a Sabbath.
Wow.
No one could ever calculate the amount of sacrifice that went into the making of this great nation, the gains of so many because of the loss of the precious few. As a child in school, I sang America the Beautiful, God bless America. We started every day by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. But a lot has changed. Biblical predictions are taking shape at an amazing pace. If you're about my age, you know that this is not the country we all grew up in. It seems like this nation is rushing toward a cliff with no possibility of return. When I became a Christian, I began studying biblical prophecy, last day events. I found a book called The Great Controversy that was amazing in its clarity. If you'd like a copy, log on to our website.
To order your free copy of The Great Controversy, go to talkingdonkeyinternational.org, click on the Store tab, and order your copy today.
If you are already thinking, I'm never going to remember all of this, we have a study guide that you're going to want to get. This is The Lost Day of History. This is study guide number 7. You can find it at talkingdonkeyinternational.org. Ask for study guide number 7. And so it makes sense that when you are doing your best to follow the pattern that the designer first designed in all of us, that your outcome is just going to be better.
Absolutely.
Janice, isn't it always interesting that science always tends to finally catch up to God in the Bible?
Right.
That's right. And I think we're slowly getting there. And, some people come up with all sorts of interesting theories about why it's not from God, but you have to really make a big leap. And to me, it almost takes, I shouldn't say almost, it does take more faith to believe in some of these strange theories about like the Circaseptan rhythm and where that came from and that sort of thing, than it does simply to say, you know what, I'm going to be humble and say, yeah, God did create the earth in 7 literal days, and he told us to rest one of those days.
Is it Occam's razor or something? The one that says the simplest answer is probably the right answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the simplest might be, oh, well, look at this book. It says God created the world in 7 days, or rested the 7th day, and that's where it all came from.
Yeah.
Seems like a fairly simple answer.
I think so.
When my wife and I were, kind of studied it ourselves, and my wife said, well, it's easy which day it is. Look on the calendar, it's the 7th day. And I thought, my wife can't be right, But
Unless you're looking at a European calendar.
yeah, they've tried to, scooch stuff around and things. Tell me, in the time we have left, you said you like stories. Do you have a story or two about, and you don't have to divulge names, of course you won't, patients or something that you just saw an amazing change because they began keeping God's 7-day Sabbath?
Well, I do. I wanted to mention one thing before we go there, if that's okay. And that is, to me, it's also fascinating to see what happens when people try to mess with that Circaseptan rhythm. We've had a couple instances of that in history on a larger scale. And for example, with the French Revolution.
Right, that's the one that came to my mind too.
Yeah, the French Revolution, I mean, they rejected religion because of the toxic religion that they had for so many years. And they got to this point where they said, you know what, we want to worship the goddess of
reason,
right? And said, well, it's not really reasonable to have a 7-day week. What's the point of that? It doesn't make any sense. And of course, they came up with their Dewey Decimal System and all of that. So they based everything on multiples of 10. And so they said, why don't we have a 10-day week? That makes a lot more sense. Well, it might have made a lot of sense in certain areas, but not for the week, because as we know, God designed it that way. And when they changed it, it really caused a lot of chaos and a lot of stress, and mental institutions quickly became overfilled. And you can start seeing, some of the downfall of that. And that wasn't the only regime or government that actually tried to change things. Did you know that also it was 150 years later or so, that Stalin actually also changed it for the USSR or Russia. And so there's Soviet Union, I guess.
That.
Yeah. So at that point, they went to a 5-day week instead of a 10-day or a 7-day.
Why did they think 5 days?
Well, what he wanted to do is he wanted to basically have people working all the time, but he would give people 4 days to work, and then they'd have 1 day off, but he always wanted people working, so constantly working, producing. And so basically they had this 5-day work week, and later they also even tried a 6-day work week. But after, I think it was like 10, 11, 12 years, something like that, they gave up because they actually became less productive. There was a lot of irresponsibility. People were really upset because they often wouldn't have the same day off as their spouse or their children, and it just created a lot of societal issues.
Because everybody's 5-day cycle started at a different time.
And so that also was a huge failure. So it's interesting when we see these lessons from history that anytime we try to go against what God's perfect order is, it really messes things up.
You're going to share that story.
That's right. So just yesterday, actually, I spoke with a patient, and she came up to me after church, and she said, I never knew about any of this stuff, the Sabbath or any of that. But I was talking to my provider a few months ago, and the provider she's seeing is someone that works at our clinic. And she said that the provider told her, you know what, you really need to go to church because, and she said it in a very nice way, but she said, I think that you need to be in fellowship with people that love God and that will help to provide that atmosphere of being nurturing and supportive. And so she encouraged her to go to this little church in the hills.
So her doctor basically gave her a prescription to go to church.
And so this lady actually started going to church, and she said, I never knew the blessing that I would receive of starting to learn about the Sabbath and learning about, taking that time of rest, learning about the joy that God wants to bring into your life and the healing and the connection. And, that's one piece that I think is often missed when we talk about the Sabbath, because in a very disconnected, lonely world, the thing that people yearn for the most is a sense of connectedness, that they're not alone. And that's really what the Sabbath provides, is it provides a platform for connection. And when you look at the scientific data, yes, all these, stress, all these other things are huge problems, but actually what we're finding is that loneliness and isolation are probably the biggest issues when it comes to negative health outcomes. And so the Sabbath, yes, it's a stress reliever, but it's also a great connector.
A community.
That's right. We connect with God, and then we connect with each other, and we really can reprioritize what is most important.
You think Jesus made the Sabbath, then he took Adam and Eve, I picture walking hand in hand in the garden, pointing at all the glorious creation.
That's right.
What can be better than that?
That's it.
Well, that's why I think the Sabbath is the answer to modern society.
Yes.
Because it addresses, obviously, physical health. Simply taking a day where you're off. You know, you're not on the treadmill of the rest of the week. So physically, it's a gift. Spiritually, it's a gift, particularly if you spend that time, you go to church, you're getting filled, whether it's by the pastor or just by the other believers. And emotionally, you're getting that connection.
That's right.
I love my church family. And you walk in and it's like, these are my people. And, you know, I know that if one of them calls during the week, you know, you've got all these connections. And I believe that modern science has come to the conclusion that one of our ills is the fact that we don't have as strong social connections as we used to have.
That's it.
You don't have the extended family around you that used to be standard. You never moved that far away. You had aunts, uncles, cousins all right around you. And now that's kind of rare. But a church family, you might be thousands of miles from your extended biological family. But church family is always here.
That's right.
Doctor, probably only have 30 seconds for you left here, but what would you counsel people? Bottom line counsel from the expert.
Well, I think the bottom line is trust the pattern, the blueprint that God has given us. It is so clear for so many reasons, for mentally, physically, relationally, and spiritually. Just choose to trust God. Take that one day a week, take the seventh day, Saturday Sabbath, and say, Lord, you know, I really want to do this, not just for me, but so that I can be refilled and be a greater blessing to those around me. That will provide more joy than anything else could.
Amen. You know, folks, I want to read you a text that is kind of amazing. And the text is found in Isaiah chapter 65. And I think about Jesus. We talked just a minute ago about Jesus walking in the garden hand in hand with Adam and Eve. Amazing time, keeping the Sabbath. And then you follow all the disciples and Jesus. They kept the Sabbath. And we come to the new earth. And here it says, for as the new heavens and new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, what's that? Month to month. Mm-hmm. And from one Sabbath to another, what's that? Week to week.
Week to week.
Shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. Think about that. In eternity, we will still worship God on the Sabbath. He's laid it out throughout the entire Bible. There's been people and organizations and whatever else try and derail it, as you talked about, and it didn't work. Didn't work. Now, I've got a final thing as the wind's blowing here. Hang on to this, but I want to offer you a great little booklet. I think you'll like this. It talks about the seventh-day Sabbath. You want to find out more information? Well, the information at the bottom of your screen, how to get this great booklet, we'll send it to you. Doctor, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It's a blessing.
Can't believe we got you.
It's been a blessing to be here.
Thank you for watching. Join us again for another exciting Country Wisdom.
See you next time.